The global order, already shaken by conflict, inequality, and deep mistrust, is once again being tested in Gaza, a place where human suffering has become an all too familiar headline. And now Indonesia, through the words of its defense minister, Prabowo Subianto, has hinted at a bold move: the deployment of 20,000 Indonesian Armed Forces troops for peacekeeping operations. Let us pause for a moment and recognize what such an announcement represents. It is not merely a military decision, but a political, economic, and moral statement directed at the international community. This potential deployment is not about force projection or expansion of influence, as so many interventions in history have tragically been. Rather, it carries the echoes of Indonesia's own struggles, its journey from colonial subjugation to independence, and its long-standing commitment to solidarity with oppressed peoples. If Prabowo follows through, the presence of 20,000 Indonesian troops in Gaza would symbolize more than boots on the ground. It would symbolize the voice of the global South, a region too often ignored, rising to say enough. Enough of endless wars with no resolution. Enough of human suffering being reduced to political theater. Enough of allowing economic interests to dictate who gets to live in peace and who does not. Prabowo Subianto's hint that Indonesia may deploy 20,000 armed forces personnel to Gaza is more than a policy suggestion. It is a calculated political signal that reverberates across international arenas. The sheer scale of such a deployment is designed to grab global attention, and in many ways, it has succeeded. When a defense minister of the world's fourth most populous country and the largest Muslim majority democracy suggests readiness to contribute so heavily to one of the world's most sensitive conflict zones, it becomes impossible for diplomats, media, and policymakers to ignore. The number itself, 20,000, is a hook, a bold figure that underscores seriousness and capacity. It suggests that Indonesia is not content with symbolic gestures, but rather seeks to play a decisive role in shaping the trajectory of peace efforts in the Middle East. This boldness stands out in a geopolitical landscape where most states limit themselves to cautious statements of concern or token humanitarian contributions. In the context of Gaza, where devastation has persisted for decades, Indonesia's signal functions as both a moral statement and a strategic maneuver. It says to the international community, if the traditional power centers of Washington, London, or Brussels cannot enforce peace, then Jakarta is prepared to at least attempt what others have failed to do. It disrupts the narrative that only established powers can intervene in global crises, instead positioning Indonesia as a nation that has both the legitimacy and the will to act. This is a hook designed not only to resonate with domestic audiences, but to provoke debate in global forums about who gets to define peacekeeping and who has the credibility to enforce it. For Prabowo himself, the suggestion also doubles as political positioning. He is not just Indonesia's defense minister, but a seasoned politician eyeing greater influence on the global stage. By hinting at this deployment, he projects Indonesia's military strength as a tool not of conquest, but of moral leadership. It appeals deeply to his domestic audience, where solidarity with Palestine has long been a defining feature of Indonesian foreign policy sentiment. To an Indonesian public wary of Western interventions that appear self-serving, the prospect of their own nation stepping in as a genuine peacekeeper is both empowering and inspiring. It feeds into a narrative of Indonesia as a rising power, capable not just of regional leadership in Southeast Asia, but of global responsibility in conflict zones far beyond its immediate borders. At the same time, the hint carries practical implications. A force of 20,000 soldiers is no minor deployment. It would require immense logistical preparation, significant financial resources, and cooperation with international bodies such as the United Nations. This is not a promise that can be carried out lightly. Yet Prabowo's phrasing, carefully couched as a hint, gives him flexibility. It allows him to project Indonesia's willingness without locking the government into a commitment that might prove politically or militarily unfeasible. This balance between ambition and pragmatism is deliberate, and it keeps both allies and adversaries guessing about Indonesia's next move. The ambiguity itself becomes a strategic tool, compelling international players to take Jakarta's role more seriously even before any boots are on the ground. The timing of such a signal is also crucial. Gaza has once again become the center of global outrage, with images of destruction circulating across media platforms and fueling anger worldwide. In moments like this, when the credibility of international institutions is questioned, states that step forward with bold proposals often gain disproportionate visibility. Indonesia's signal positions it as a champion of humanitarian values at a time when many governments appear paralyzed. By hinting at an intervention of this magnitude, Prabowo ensures that Indonesia is seen not just as a bystander, but as an active agent in shaping the discourse on Gaza. Hooks are woven throughout this message: the audacity of the number, the contrast with Western inaction, the moral resonance of a Muslim majority force potentially entering Gaza as peacekeepers, and the domestic appeal of Indonesia finally stepping into a role that matches its population size, economic strength, and historical commitments. Each of these hooks captures different audiences: international policymakers, domestic voters, Palestinian supporters, and even skeptics of Western dominance in global affairs. That is why this hint is more than rhetoric. It is a maneuver that raises Indonesia's profile and challenges the conventional order of peacekeeping, forcing a recalibration of expectations about who can act as a guarantor of peace in the world's most contentious regions. The suggestion that Indonesia may deploy 20,000 troops to Gaza is not only significant in scale, but transformative in its geopolitical implications, because it represents a shift in global dynamics that challenges long-standing structures of power. For decades, peacekeeping missions have been dominated, financed, and controlled by Western-led coalitions or UN operations heavily influenced by the United States, European powers, and their allies. The assumption has long been that meaningful interventions in international conflicts must be spearheaded or approved by these powers. Indonesia's signal disrupts this assumption. It asserts that the global South is no longer merely a passive recipient of international decisions, but an active player capable of reshaping the way conflicts are managed and resolved. The symbolic weight of this shift is immense. When a country like Indonesia steps forward, it represents not only its own interests, but the aspirations of a wider coalition of nations often marginalized in global diplomacy. It gives voice to a bloc of states and peoples who feel that their perspectives have been sidelined in favor of Western priorities. Gaza, a conflict zone where Western mediation has repeatedly failed, becomes the stage upon which this new dynamic is tested. By hinting at a massive deployment, Indonesia positions itself as a leader among nations that share solidarity with Palestine, frustration with Western dominance, and a desire to craft alternative solutions to entrenched crises. This is the kind of hook that reframes global politics, the idea that meaningful solutions might come not from Washington or Brussels but from Jakarta, standing at the crossroads of Asia and the Islamic world. Indonesia's history adds layers to this narrative. As a nation that fought for independence against colonial powers, it carries credibility in speaking to issues of occupation and self-determination. Unlike Western nations whose interventions are often shadowed by economic or strategic interests, Indonesia can claim a different moral legitimacy. This is precisely what makes its potential role in Gaza so disruptive. It does not fit the familiar pattern of intervention for gain. Instead, it is rooted in solidarity, cultural affinity, and a long-standing commitment to Palestinian statehood. That difference in itself challenges the geopolitical status quo and raises uncomfortable questions for powers that have profited from maintaining the existing order of endless negotiations and stalled peace processes. The very scale of Indonesia's hinted deployment amplifies this challenge. 20,000 troops are not a token gesture. They represent a serious commitment, one that rivals or even exceeds contributions typically offered by Western states to UN peacekeeping missions. This scale changes the perception of Indonesia from being a supportive actor in international affairs to being a potential leader of a new model of peacekeeping. It suggests that the global South is no longer content with symbolic gestures of solidarity, but is ready to marshal real resources, real manpower, and real political capital in pursuit of solutions. For the first time in decades, the balance of initiative in a conflict like Gaza could tilt away from established powers and toward a nation outside their orbit. Such a shift inevitably provokes questions and tensions. Will Western powers support Indonesia's move, attempt to co-opt it, or quietly obstruct it? Will regional actors view Indonesia's presence as impartial peacekeeping or as a projection of influence by another external player? These uncertainties are precisely why Indonesia's signal is so disruptive. It destabilizes the comfortable equilibrium in which the same set of actors control the narrative, the funding, and the framework of peace efforts. By introducing a new player with moral weight and regional legitimacy, Indonesia forces all sides to recalculate. This recalibration itself is a hook. It draws attention to how fragile and outdated the old system has become, and it spotlights the potential for new players to redefine it. Domestically, this shift also reinforces Indonesia's role as a bridge between the Islamic world, the developing global South, and the broader international community. Prabowo's hint taps into a powerful identity narrative. Indonesia is not only Southeast Asia's giant, but also the world's largest Muslim majority democracy. And it carries responsibilities that extend beyond its immediate region. The message resonates with Indonesians who have long felt that their country's size and history entitle it to a greater voice in global affairs. It also speaks to international audiences who are eager for alternatives to the familiar, often ineffective, frameworks of Western-led intervention. The hooks in this dynamic are compelling. A global South power challenging Western dominance in peacekeeping, a Muslim majority nation potentially reshaping the narrative in Gaza, and the scale of the proposed deployment signaling seriousness rather than symbolism. Each of these elements forces the world to pay attention not only to Indonesia's intentions, but to the broader question of whether the old structures of international politics are still fit for purpose. If Indonesia's hint becomes reality, it will not just be about soldiers on the ground. It will be about the emergence of a new pole of influence in global conflict resolution. One rooted not in empire, but in solidarity, not in profit, but in principle. The suggestion that Indonesia could send 20,000 troops to Gaza carries with it an undeniable sense of ambition. But beneath the boldness lies a high-stakes gamble that stretches across military, diplomatic, and political dimensions. Deploying forces into one of the most volatile and contested regions in the world is not the same as peacekeeping in neutral zones or post-conflict societies where the guns have already gone silent. Gaza is an active flashpoint marked by deep distrust, unresolved grievances, and ongoing hostilities. To hint at such a deployment is to step into a vortex of complexity where every move is scrutinized, contested, and weighed not only by local actors but also by global powers with vested interests. This is precisely why the signal is so gripping. It is a move that could either elevate Indonesia to global leadership status or embroil it in an intractable conflict where even the most noble intentions risk being misunderstood or undermined. The first gamble lies in acceptance. Would Israel allow such a deployment? Historically, Israel has resisted the presence of foreign troops on territory it views as central to its security concerns. Peacekeeping in Gaza is not simply a matter of sending soldiers in. It requires cooperation from those who control the airspace, the borders, and the broader framework of the conflict. Without Israeli consent, Indonesian troops could quickly find themselves cast not as neutral peacekeepers but as unwelcome outsiders. That risk is magnified by the fact that Indonesia has no formal diplomatic relations with Israel, a reality that could complicate not only the logistics but also the trust needed for such an operation to succeed. The second gamble is with Palestinian factions themselves. While solidarity with Palestine runs deep in Indonesian politics and society, the ground reality in Gaza is fractured. Different groups have competing visions, strategies, and alliances. A foreign peacekeeping force, even one motivated by solidarity, might find itself navigating a minefield of suspicion. One group might view the troops as protectors, another as meddlers, while others could attempt to draw them into the conflict for their own advantage. The neutrality required for peacekeeping is difficult to sustain in a context where allegiances shift and narratives are contested daily. This risk is not theoretical. History is full of peacekeeping forces caught in crossfires or accused of bias when the realities of war force them into impossible choices. Internationally, the gamble extends even further. Western powers, who have traditionally dominated discussions on Middle East peace efforts, may not welcome a major intervention led by a global South nation. While they might offer rhetorical support for humanitarian goals, behind closed doors there could be efforts to dilute, delay, or redirect Indonesia's initiative to maintain control over the framework of intervention. The United States, in particular, has long used its leverage in the region to dictate the terms of engagement, and it is far from certain that it would stand aside while another country sets new rules. The European Union, too, might hesitate to embrace an operation that it does not lead or fund. Thus, Indonesia risks not only logistical difficulties, but also diplomatic pushback from powerful states that see this as an erosion of their influence. Then comes the domestic gamble. Deploying 20,000 troops halfway across the world is not only a strategic move, but also an economic and political one. The financial cost will be immense, raising questions at home about whether resources are being diverted from domestic priorities. If the mission faces difficulties, casualties, stalemates, or accusations of bias, the political blowback in Jakarta could be severe. Prabowo's reputation as a decisive leader could be tarnished if the gamble fails, and the Indonesian public, proud of their solidarity with Palestine, could grow restless if the mission becomes entangled in endless conflict with little visible progress. Yet it is exactly this mix of risks that makes the move so captivating on the global stage. The gamble is a hook in itself. It sparks debates about whether Indonesia is overreaching or rising to its rightful place. It challenges assumptions about who can act and who must stay on the sidelines. It dares to confront the failures of previous interventions by proposing something audacious in scale and intent. And while the dangers are real, so too is the potential payoff, the chance for Indonesia to carve out a historic role as a new kind of peacekeeper, one motivated by solidarity rather than self-interest, one that redefines the very idea of who can lead in international crisis. This high-stakes gamble forces the world to pay attention not only to Gaza, but to Jakarta, a capital that suddenly finds itself at the center of conversations about global peace and power. The symbolism of Indonesia's potential deployment of 20,000 troops to Gaza is perhaps even more powerful than the logistical or military dimension. Symbolism matters in politics often more than the technicalities, and in this case it would carry a weight that resonates across continents. Indonesia is the largest Muslim-majority nation on earth, home to over 270 million people, and it has consistently voiced its support for Palestinian statehood since its own independence. For decades, Indonesians have viewed the Palestinian struggle as an echo of their own anti-colonial history, a reflection of the fight for dignity and sovereignty. To now consider sending thousands of its soldiers into Gaza under a peacekeeping mandate is to transform that solidarity from words and resolutions into concrete action. That transformation is a powerful hook. It takes a sentiment long present in Indonesian foreign policy and elevates it into a defining gesture on the world stage. The moral force of such a move cannot be understated. For Palestinians who have lived through decades of displacement, conflict, and repeated failures of international diplomacy, the arrival of Indonesian troops would not look like yet another foreign occupation. Instead, it could be seen as a gesture of fraternity, an act of solidarity from a people who share their faith, their historical memories of struggle, and their yearning for independence. The symbolism here is fundamentally different from Western-led interventions, where the latter are often viewed with suspicion. Framed as part of a larger geopolitical agenda, Indonesian troops could carry with them a sense of genuine empathy. That difference in perception is critical. It is the kind of symbolism that can shift how communities on the ground respond to the presence of foreign soldiers, determining whether they are seen as protectors or intruders. Beyond Palestine itself, the symbolism ripples outward into the Islamic world. Many Muslim-majority nations have long spoken of Palestinian solidarity. Yet few have made tangible contributions that match the scale of their rhetoric. Indonesia, by hinting at such a large deployment, places itself in a unique position not merely as a vocal supporter, but as a nation willing to shoulder responsibility. This creates a hook for the wider Muslim world, reminding governments and peoples alike that symbolic gestures are not enough when lives are being lost. It challenges others to reconsider their roles, to ask whether they too are willing to move from rhetoric to real commitment. In this way, Indonesia's action is not just symbolic solidarity, but catalytic solidarity, an example meant to inspire others. At the same time, the symbolism extends far beyond religious or regional lines. For the global South more broadly, Indonesia's step would represent the assertion of agency in a world order that has long sidelined developing nations. It would show that peacekeeping and humanitarian responsibility are not the exclusive domain of wealthy Western countries. The idea that a nation like Indonesia can mobilize 20,000 troops for peace redefines the narrative of international responsibility. This is a hook that resonates not only in Asia and the Middle East, but in Africa, Latin America, and other regions that share histories of colonial exploitation and marginalization in global decision-making. It says, we too answer and lead, we too can act, and we too have the moral authority to intervene where others have failed. For Indonesia itself, the symbolism is internally significant as well. Such a deployment would project an image of the nation fulfilling its destiny as a bridge between worlds, between Islam and democracy, between the global South and international institutions, between its colonial past and its aspirations as a rising power. The domestic narrative would be one of pride, that Indonesia is no longer merely observing international crises, but shaping their outcomes. For ordinary Indonesians, it could deepen a sense of national identity rooted not only in economic progress, but in moral responsibility. This, too, is a hook. It ties together nationalism, religion, and internationalism in a way that resonates powerfully with diverse audiences at home. Even the optics of Indonesian soldiers landing in Gaza would be charged with meaning. Images of peacekeepers from a Muslim-majority democracy standing between civilians and armed conflict would circulate worldwide, challenging stereotypes, countering cynicism, and reframing the possibilities of intervention. Such images would stand as visual proof that solidarity can take tangible form, that words can be matched with deeds. In an era where symbolism often feels hollow, this would be a rare example of symbolism grounded in action. The symbolism of solidarity in this case is layered and multidimensional, a gesture toward Palestinians of fraternity, a challenge to the Islamic world to act, an assertion of agency for the global South, and a moment of national pride for Indonesians themselves. Each layer carries its own hooks, drawing in different audiences but converging on the same idea that solidarity, when transformed into action, can alter the trajectory of history. That is what makes Prabowo's hint so much more than a military signal. It is a symbolic act with the potential to redefine how nations understand their responsibilities and their power to shape peace. So I leave you with this thought: if 20,000 Indonesian peacekeepers truly march into Gaza, they will carry more than rifles. They will carry the weight of expectation, the burden of justice, and the possibility of rewriting a story that for too long has been drenched in despair. And that, my friends, is a moment the world cannot afford to ignore. Thank you.